For our interview today, I'll be asking a series of questions about your experience with disability activism in Utah. We have an hour for our interview, so please feel free to share stories in as much detail as you can remember. So just to get started, could you tell us your name and a little bit about you?
Okay, my name's Ron Faerber. I was born and raised here in Salt Lake County. It was the unincorporated area located at the south end of the valley in 1966, and kind of have over the years watched the valley grow. I went to school here, went to college here, graduated in 1995 with BS in chemistry and a minor in computer science. And I got married in 1980 or 1991. But my wife and I, Carrie, have been together since 1988. We had our first daughter, Jessie, in 1989, and our son in 1991, and then we got married, and then our third child, Hannah, was born in 1992.
That's great to hear. In that period, how long have you been involved in disability activism in Utah?
So when I met my wife, she had mentioned to me that she was diagnosed at 17 years old with multiple sclerosis. And back in 1988, I, had no idea what that was. She looked fine to me and she seemed fine. And I just thought, being naive, that you could just take maybe a Tylenol for that or something and you'd be fine. But of course, as time progressed, as our relationship grew, started noticing that she would stumble and have difficulty with speech and language and thought and some different things, and you could tell there was some neurological things going on. So, but I think not until our youngest daughter Hannah was born in 1992. Hannah was born normal. She went 9 months and everything, but she just didn't develop like our other two children had developed, and she was kind of, I guess, you had to support her head all the time. She couldn't really roll very good. She could focus on you, but then her eyes would drift. And so I just noticed different developmental issues or milestones that weren't being reached as our other two children. And it was then that you start to realize that something may not be right. And, I think at that point you just try to do what you can. Back in the early 90s, the medical treatment, there wasn't a lot known. I think they were just starting to find out a lot of advancements in medical treatment. And so, we reached out to our physicians, and that's kind of how I got started in the disability arena. So.
And what was it about that experience that motivated you to get involved? What types of opportunities were there at that point in time, even in Utah, to get involved?
So, we started facing stuff, and it's interesting that you don't ask for this stuff. I think it presents itself to you. So when you're like with Hannah, we started dealing with different medical concerns and issues. I was working full time and started having trouble with coverage and medical stuff, and you're like, okay, wait a minute, what's going on? And then I think it's not like you go out searching for problems. They just start falling in your lap, and you have to sort through them. And dealing with serious issues that most people don't have to deal with. So, but yeah, we would get into, all of a sudden, before you know it, we're in these major, like, they're not quite legal fights, but they seemed like legal fights with insurance, with your employer, with the schools, with, I mean, almost every aspect of life. You start falling into these issues, and it's like a fight or a battle. And I think back then we started running into housing issues, and this is, I mean, early on, like 92, 91, 92. And that's when I kind of reached out to the Disabled Rights Action Committee, because you start looking, and back then it was the phone book. And you go through the phone book and you look, and luckily the Disabled Rights Action Committee was listed in the phone book. And so I called the number, and I'm not sure who I talked to back then. I think it was 93, somewhere, I would say in the spring, March, April of 93. And they said, oh yeah, come on down. Here's our address. So I packed my wife and my 3 kids up, and we went down to a meeting, and it was at a warehouse. And they had a big garage door, and the door was open, and when we pulled up and parked, there wasn't a lot of spaces to park, and we parked, we got out, and the whole place was filled. There must have been 100 people with disabilities there, with the Disabled Rights Action Committee. We pulled up, and I think Ricky Landers came up to me, and Barbara Toomer came up to me, and they were very welcoming and took us in, and they, talked to us, and but we sat through the whole meeting, and I can't quite remember what issues they were talking about, but it's interesting to meet so many people that were having the same issues that we were at the time, and it was either medical issues or transportation issues or like healthcare or housing. There was always some, and it was all the same issues, and that's kind of where we started.
So, as someone who's worked within the disability rights movement for quite a while, you've likely encountered a variety of disability groups that have different approaches to social change. What can you remember about how you got involved with DRAC in the first place, and what was it about the organization that was interesting or different from other groups?
So when I looked, like I said, I looked through the phone book, and there were a few listed, and I remember at the time when I called through that some of the other ones I probably didn't get an answer on the phone, or somebody would answer and probably say, oh, we can't help you with that, or we don't do that, or but when I called the Disabled Rights, they were like, we have a meeting like once or twice a month, come to our meeting, and that's how I ended up going there, just to find some kind of help, because there was nothing back then.
And can you remember any of the folks that you made contact with when you first got involved? What type of crowd did we have?
So I remember Dick was there. I met Dick and his wife, and I don't think they brought I think it was their son. Ricky Landers, she was always very greeting. She would hug people that she didn't even know, she would introduce herself. And Barbara would always, she would stroll over in her wheelchair and introduce herself, and was always very open, and wanted to know who you were and what your issues were, and was very inviting. And let's see, who else was there? Oh, Ray Gom. Once I was talking to Barbara, about our housing issues, she introduced me to Ray Gom, and she asked Ray to give me a hand with some of the issues we had. And Ray was kind of the Disabled Rights Action Committee housing specialist at the time, and he was dealing with other housing issues with other clients or other members. And but yeah, I'm trying to think. Ted Loosely was there. He was always pretty quiet. And who else was there? Kay Fox. She was working to get her attorney or lawyer's license, and was still in school. I think she was going to the U here in law school, and working for a firm. But she did a lot of work with DRAC and the Salt Lake Community Action Program, and yeah, I think, yeah. Anyway.
So when you first got involved in that early era between about 1993 and 2003, are there any events that stand out as especially noteworthy or significant?
So what I found was that Barbara Toomer and the leaders or board members of DRAC, Ricky and Ray Gom and a few of the folks, they didn't actually, and I wasn't expecting it, but you go there for help, and just to know that those other people were understood and they listened and that they could relate to your issues. But when you talk to them, it wasn't that they were going to say, okay, I'm gonna take over, like, and do your case or something like that. It was more of it was information and it was feedback, and that education or information that you received from these folks just empowered you to go off, and you knew they would explain, these are your rights, and this is they can do this, they can't do this, and that gave you a sense of empowerment to go back home and do more research and and advocate for yourself and your family. So.
And are there any particular issues that DRAC was focusing on during that era? Have they changed at all until the present?
So, we were really dealing with some serious accessibility issues into structures. We didn't have ramps into libraries back then. There weren't ramps in the schools. The schools didn't want to integrate disabled children with other children. It was a very different era back then, and we just started getting into Section 504, which gave rights to kids in schools, that they had the same access and abilities to learn as other kids. And so we were dealing with a lot of accessibility, housing, educational, healthcare was a big thing too, and transportation. These issues back then were just not even dealt with. It was like we were just barely starting to deal with stuff. Now you see quite a bit of progress. There's still issues and there's still a lot of ignorance out there, but it's come a long way from then.
Are there any specific actions that you can remember participating in that stand out in your mind that you might have a story to share about?
Sure. I think we were always involved. So I know a lot of the guys were involved in transportation issues. I wasn't really involved in a lot of the transportation stuff. It didn't hit me as hard because I could pick my daughter up and put her in a car seat and scoot her off somewhere. Whereas a lot of these guys were in these big bulky wheelchairs and they couldn't get into a vehicle. So they were having, it was a lot of their fight on that. I was dealing more with healthcare issues and housing issues. So those two issues and schools. So those three issues were mainly my focus. And so I tended to focus on what I could. If they needed help with like UTA or something, I would go down if I had time to lend a hand. But generally, if I was more involved in the healthcare, so if there was a healthcare issue with insurance at the state Department of Health or Medicaid or health insurance issues, I was always right there. So one of the healthcare issues that I stand out a lot is we've had good governors over the years and we've had bad governors. And bad, I mean, as in they would totally just were focusing the funding on other issues, and we were just not getting any help for people with disabilities. And I remember one time we hit some budget constraints, and when budgets get tight up at the legislature, there's a lot of scrambling for little pockets of money. And I remember one time we had gotten with Crossroads Urban Center, and Bill Tibbetts and a bunch of their group and Barbara Toomer and the Disabled Rights Action Committee group got together, and we were sitting down in a meeting on how we can address the issues of healthcare with the legislature. And, it kept coming out in the media that they were going to just take a hatchet to healthcare. And that was how it was presented to us. So we came up with the idea of, rather than take a hatchet to it, use a scalpel. And so we got surgeons' masks and we got white coats and the outfits that like nurses wear and stuff, and we had signs, don't hack it up, or use a scalpel instead of a hatchet and stuff like that. And I remember going up to the ledge, and the media was up there, and I think it made a really loud resonation with the legislature. So they ended up, rather than just butchering certain programs, they were able to trim areas that and we were able to squeak by with, and it didn't hurt too bad that year. So
it's a great story.
yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit about what it's like to work within a movement where so many members have different disabilities and sometimes dramatically different life experiences. From your perspective, what is it that brings everyone together in a disability rights organization or within this movement?
I think what brings us together is the common, well, we've all experienced the same things over and over again. And I mean, if somebody's having a transportation issue, even though it doesn't affect everybody at the same time, at some point it's going to affect them. Or accessibility into a program, or healthcare issues, anything like that. I think we all have that common denominator where people or issues present themselves, and it kind of affects everybody who has a disability in some way. So I think that's what brings us together.
And it sounds like shared experiences around issues of housing, transportation, healthcare, institutionalization are part of what bring everyone together in our space.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Can you think of any experience you've had where an individual's lack of accessibility has mobilized the group around an issue? Somebody maybe couldn't get on a bus when they needed to, and it highlighted the need for broader accessibility within the state.
I think so. So generally, so for example, with my daughter, the insurance was going to cut, the insurance was paying for nutritional formula for these kids. Well, formula, you think, oh yeah, you have a baby and you're paying for diapers and formula. And then, they grow out of their diapers and they go into pull-ups, and then they grow out of their pull-ups and you train them to go to the bathroom on their own. And, you buy formula, so it's real expensive when they're babies. Well, when you have a child that doesn't grow out of diapers and doesn't grow out of the formula, you're buying diapers for the rest of their lives, and you're buying formula for the rest of their lives. So the amount of, it's expensive, and you can't graduate or progress out of that. You're still doing that for the rest of your life. And insurance at the time was saying, okay, if you're disabled and you're at this age where you should have probably progressed out of formula, obviously it's a medical need at that point, and so they say, oh, well, we're going to continue to cover that. It came to a point where with my daughter, the state said, oh, we're not going to pay for that anymore. So the insurance says, oh, we're not paying for it anymore because the state's not paying for it. And so when I was like, well, wait a minute, that's devastating to our budget. We're not going to make it. And, we've still got 2 other kids to feed, and we're not going to make it. This was back when I was in school and working and caring for 3 kids, and we didn't have a lot of money. So, so I started looking into it, and the feds were saying, no, they have to pay for everything until they're 21 years old. And so when I found out that the feds said that the feds are giving the state a huge amount of money every year, and that money has to be spent per their regulations, and the state says, oh, we're not going to cover this, but the feds say you have to. So I held the state accountable to that, and so a particular issue like that ended up, I filed a complaint in the courts, and then I seen that was starting to go in circles because the attorneys would just sit there every time we get together and they'd just argue around and around and around and got nowhere. So I went to Barbara and I said, look, this is what's going on. And so Barbara was like, well, let's jump in on this. So they did a telephone conference call with the Department of Health, and then it got into another loop thing. So we approached it legally, we approached it with the politically with the state, or I guess with the administration. Then we started approaching it publicly. And so we had a meeting, and I just put the word out, and this is right when the internet came out. I think it was I want to say it was Netscape was the search engine back then. And when I threw it out there, all of a sudden all these parents were having the same issue. And so we organized a group meeting, and it was an election year, and I remember the gentleman who owns X-Mission was running against Senator Hatch for the Senate seat, and so I invited all the candidates and all the parents and the media to this meeting we were going to have, and none of the politicians except I think his name was Pete, but he was the owner of X-Mission. He was running against Senator Hatch at the time. And the media showed up, and all the parents were there, but none of the other politicians showed up. Well, it was funny because it went out on the news, and it wasn't good for Senator Hatch at the time. And the next morning at 7 a.m. in the morning, my phone went off, and it was Senator Hatch's office. And they wanted to meet with us. And so we got a few other folks that were having similar issues, but there was another couple that had a kid that was in I think it was a nursing home, and they wouldn't allow the child to go home with the parents. even though the parents wanted the child at home. So I think there was something going on there. And so I invited them to just come and give their issue, but our main issue was the formula issue. And we sat down with Senator Hatch and his folks and had our meeting. And after the meeting, the state administrators came in and they started setting up meetings with us. And we rewrote the policy for the state for coverage on formula. So basically it was coming down to the point where if you were, the argument got, if you were G-tube fed, they would cover it. If you were orally fed, they wouldn't cover it. And so we fought that and actually had it changed. We won. And I think it opened it up for all the kids across the state. Now, I don't know how long that lasted, but it's funny how these things tend to just keep, I don't know. It's politics. So.
Well, that's a great story. I really appreciate that. Changing topics just a little bit, I want to talk about the way that the disability movement has progressed over the years that you've been involved. We've come a long way since the passage of the ADA in 1990. In that time that you've been working on disability issues, how have you seen that landscape evolve? What's different today?
So I think in the early 90s or even in the 80s, you just didn't see people out much with disabilities in wheelchairs. And I think, I think because they just couldn't get around. They were homebound and they stayed home and they didn't get out. And I think now what I'm seeing is I'm starting to see people with disabilities engaged in, you're seeing people everywhere now. And they're in libraries, they're in grocery stores, they're going down the sidewalk, they're in classes, they're at work, they're everywhere. And it's really nice to see that they're integrated that way. So.
In large part due to the passage of the ADA.
Yes.
DRAC that have fought for implementation.
Yes, absolutely. I think Barbara at the time, she had her finger right on the pulse of the political environment, and she knew when she could sense when the wind was changing, and she would organize a counter to that change, and we would, she would round up the troops. We've got to do this. And everyone would go down, and because we knew that she knew when and what to react and when to react to it, and we would block something. And I think our biggest thing was we could block stuff from happening, and that was our biggest tool. So.
And that brings us into our next question, which is, what can you remember about our founder, Barbara Toomer? And do you have any stories about Barbara that might illustrate what she was like as a leader in Utah's disability space?
So, Barbara was very composed. She was always very business. She didn't like drama, and she didn't have time for it. She used to be a nurse, and I remember her telling me, we'd sit down and talk for we'd have long conversations. I remember her telling me that she was a nurse in the Army, and she had to deal with a lot of stuff, and after she contracted polio, I think she just that compassion that she had toward people was still there. It was like she just shifted from a nurse caring for people now to a person who suffered a disability, and now she's advocating for people rather than helping them with their health issues in their lives that way. She was helping in another way. So she was an amazing person. She always told me, or I think she taught me. She was more of a mentor, and I think she didn't have the time to actually do stuff, but she would sit down with me if I had an issue and say, we would have a quick conversation, and it was like we were just clicking all the time, and she could say, well, this is what you need to do here, here, and this, and then that would be it. I'd go off and do it, and I could, I didn't depend on her, and I think that's what she empowered everyone in the Disabled Rights Action Committee to do. Was she would give you the information that you needed and send you on your way, and you would do it yourself, no matter how disabled you were. And of course, some people needed a little more help, but with me, of course, I'm not disabled, but yeah, it was more of an educational thing, and she would say, "This is what you need to do," and that's all I needed to take.
Do you have any stories about any time where Barbara took point on an issue and it succeeded?
So I know transportation was one that they always fought, and it started out with like accessible sidewalks, and then it led to accessible public transportation, and then it led from that to private business like taxis and stuff, transportation. And I think that today we're still having issues with that, but she had made strides in accessibility for public transportation. I think without Barbara, you probably wouldn't. We still might be fighting accessible public transportation right now. So
Yeah, I've heard that. And then based on what we've said today about the changing landscape for disability advocacy, what important issues do you think are unresolved, and what issues are most pressing today?
So I think it's funny if we don't keep developers knowing that we're still here and that they can't just develop stuff, because if you don't keep on them, they will develop buildings that nobody in a wheelchair can use. I mean, they'll develop grocery stores that you can't get in with a wheelchair, or and I think it's funny if you step back and you say, okay, the fight's over and we can sit back and relax. You can't. That's what I've found is it's never over, because people tend to just wipe it all away and forget that anything ever happened, and they'll start creating a society that doesn't include people with disabilities. So
Yeah. And could you speak to some of the issue areas that DRAC is working on as an organization today?
So today we still strive to fight accessibility for people, healthcare issues. We're still working on that. And I think a lot of mental health issues are big now, and I'm not sure what's happened. I think I'm seeing more mental health issues now than I used to see 20, 30 years ago. And I'm wondering if we're not polluting ourselves with the environment that we're in, and it's having a neurological effect to us. I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm seeing it more and more. And I think mental health is definitely a big one. Housing issues and accessibility issues. So I think healthcare too. So
And community care.
and transportation.
And transportation, yes. Are there any other topics that we haven't touched on today, but that you'd like to speak about, or do you have any memorable stories to share?
So, it's interesting. I've seen DRAC, the Disabled Rights Action Committee, change at least 4, maybe 5 times. So in the beginning, you had the Crossroads group, and then it changed with Barbara, and there was a big, really strong group for maybe 7 years, 6 or 7 years. And then that group kind of changed again to another group, and then it changed again to another group. And I'm seeing the disabled rights right now going through another change, and I'm glad to see the change because I've seen it change so many times. And I know a lot of the older guys are like, "Oh, I don't like change." But if the disabled rights didn't change with the times, I don't think we would be existing right now. So we've got new blood, new folks, new young people, educated, and they've got their finger on the pulse, and that's I almost want to say a gift if you can feel what's going on in society at the time. We've got the police stuff going on and the racist stuff, and disability stuff goes along with that. So it's interesting, and I think the change is a good thing. It has to happen if we're to survive. So.
And speaking of stories that you might be able to share, I know that you were at least a little bit involved in some of the lawsuits with DRAC and fair housing issues in previous eras. Mm-hmm. Do you have any stories to share about those fair housing violations or anything in that area?
Sure. So I know Ray back in the day, so I have some of my own personal issues. Again, Barbara, sometimes there were so many issues that DRAC couldn't take on every issue. So she would say, she would just advise me, this is what you need to do. And so I would take care of my own issues, and I was winning my own legal battles with healthcare and housing and all kinds of stuff. But Ray Gom and Barbara had taken on some big development issues, and they were accessibility stuff. And I know some of those went on for 7 to 9 years. And, paying lawyers for 7 to 9 years on both sides, it got to a point where they just finally came to the table and said, that's it. What do you guys want? And I know a couple of settlements came out that, okay, look, if you make changes and handicap parking and change some of your units into handicap accessible. And then with the lawsuit, I know one of them, they garnered I want to say 30 units or something from a developer. And so we were able to house 30 people with disabilities in those units for free. So as part of the settlement. And so we were always doing stuff like that, and it was amazing. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap up for today?
I'm excited to see where DRAC's going, and I hope that it garners and we can do as much as we used to do. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Ron.
Yep. Thank you.